Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. I am very honored to have a distinguished guest for our episode today, Dr. Rand Waltzman. Dr. Waltzman has over 40 years of experience performing and managing research in artificial intelligence applied to domains including social media and cognitive security in the information environment. He's formerly Deputy Chief Technology Officer and a Senior Information Scientist at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California. Prior to joining Rand, he was the Acting Chief Technology Officer of the Software Engineering Institute in Washington, D.C. of Carnegie Mellon University. And before that, you did a 5-year tour as a program manager in the Information Innovation Office of DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where you created and managed the social media and strategic communications program and the anomaly detection at multiple scales insider threat detection program. Wow, there's more. We'll add it to the blog, Dr. Waltzman. But first, I want to just say I've been following you on Twitter. You put up little cartoons and a little statement in your at CogSec, if I'm remembering, cognitive security is your term. You say if you don't understand all these techniques, then you're at risk. And then you explain a social psychology principle. You give some examples of it. And I just think everyone should be following you and learning from you, because that's the only way out of this hole that we seem to be in. Because indeed, information has been weaponized. So with that as the intro, I just think you have such an amazing body of insight into what's been happening and this polarization effect that has been happening in a number of years. So with that, I would like to invite you to give us your opening wisdom, please.
Well, I guess my opening statement would be, it's every man for himself, every man, woman, and child for themselves in this environment, because, there really isn't anybody out there who's going to watch your back. So,
and that's a shame, because we would think the government would have legislation on platforms and keep out foreign state actors who've been penetrating our minds, Russia, China, Iran, to name just a few, and then, extremist groups, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and white supremacists, etc. But I'm in alignment with you that we have to protect ourselves and our family and friends, but I guess I'm more optimistic that we can try to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and do a mass education program.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. People, one of the politically correct approaches to this problem is what's known as media literacy training. Mm-hmm. And so an interesting thing about media literacy training is, how many people is it really likely to be effective with? Mm-hmm. I mean, and I think that's a serious question. I mean, how long have we been teaching arithmetic in schools? And how many people are really good at doing something as basic as fractions? Mm-hmm. It's limited, I would say. So now you're telling people that they should develop the same skills as an investigative journalist or an open source intelligence analyst. Yeah, I just don't see that happening on a massive scale. Mm-hmm. There was a report written for the European Commission mm-hmm. a few years back.
Yeah.
And in this report, they said, well, there were 3 basic approaches they had to dealing with the problem of disinformation and manipulation through the media. Mm-hmm. And one of them, of course, was media literacy training. That was one of them.
Right.
And another one was, all of the platforms are going to open their kimonos and provide all this research people with all the data they could possibly want to study this problem. Well, that I think that puts
they
you...
have thousands of lobbyists to try to stall or prevent that.
Well, but I mean, saying that this is good, that they think this is the way to go, I mean, I think that tells you pretty much where their head is at in terms of actually taking any real action to deal with the problem. I mean, it's not, they're just not going to do it. They're bogged down in all kinds of issues, and it makes it impossible to do anything. Mm. But the interesting question about this media literacy training is, think about the whole idea of vaccinations and herd immunity. The question is, how many people need to be vaccinated before you get this effect of so-called herd immunity? Well, I'm not sure anybody really knows the answer to that. I think that's probably a research question. But I would pose a similar question to this whole idea of media literacy training. How many people would it take, and in what kind of distribution over what kind of demographics would it take for people to really, really get a grip on this in order for it to make a difference to society as a whole? And I haven't heard anybody pose that question, and I think it's a very interesting question. I have no idea what the answer is. I mean, this is a research problem, which I think it might be worthwhile for somebody to take up.
Great, and we're going to trumpet that because I think that we need to develop inoculation programs, which is what you're posting on Twitter, attempts to be. But I think if we can find some young people to lead the way to their peers and introduce this. I know my son, when he was in high school, had a whole class on the social dilemma documentary and trying to look at what is the source of information and stop sharing before you actually read and double check that it's actually factual. So there is some small efforts being made, but I really do think this is an epidemic, and we have to treat it like a mind virus because our minds can be hacked. As a former cult member, that's my story.
Well, I think the interesting thing to ask your son is, well, of his entire class, how many people in the class did he think this really had an effect on? Or I mean, if he talked to them, if he had any feeling for it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's what you want to know.
Yes.
And and then there's the question, like I said, well, how many does it really take to make a difference in the society as a whole? And like I said, I think these are unknown. The answers are unknown, and these are good research problems.
Yes. So you're one of the founding members of the Information Professionals Association. Tell us about that organization, please.
Well, so it's a professional organization for people who work or who are interested in this area, general area. It's a place to, exchange information. It's a platform to exchange information, and I mean the same thing as any other kind of professional society. One of the things that we have, which I think has worked out spectacularly well, is our own podcast.
Oh.
So we have a weekly podcast.
What's it called?
Yes, it's called the Cognitive Crucible.
Okay.
The Cognitive Crucible. I recommend it to everybody. We've had over 100 episodes already, and have really top people in the field, and very, very interesting conversations. So I highly recommend that to everybody.
Great. And I suspect you've given a few episode interviews, or you do the interviews?
I was number one. I gave the first episode.
Okay.
I did the first, and I did the 100th.
Okay.
So I did the first, and I did the 100th.
That's awesome. So are you comfortable talking about your perspective on how millions of Americans got radicalized to actually believe the nonsense that the 2020 election was won by Trump? Are you willing to wade into any political discussion where we're sitting right now?
Yeah, it's just it's a good example of the success you can have with these kind of techniques. And these the techniques, sort of the fundamentals of all of this stuff isn't new. The reason is because people aren't new. People haven't changed, in a very, very long time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And these kind of techniques have been applied to people for, millennia. I mean, as long as we've had civilization, people have been manipulated by their so-called leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not a new thing. The idea of that is not new. What is new today is the scale that you can do this on.
Right.
So, I mean, things can happen much faster at a spectacularly sped up rate and at a spectacularly pushed out geographic distance.
Right.
And, some guy, something happens in one part of the world and it's news, and then on the other side of the world, like almost immediately.
Yes.
So the fact that you have this kind of changes in spatial extent and compression of time, I think they introduce instabilities into the system.
Absolutely.
And that really sort of changes. I think that results in sort of fundamental qualitative changes to the way these things work. And, it's a little bit like a modern jet fighter plane. Without hundreds of computers in the plane, a human being couldn't fly the plane.
Right.
Because it's too responsive and it does too much and it does it too fast. And it's like way beyond what a human being without any computer mediation could manage.
Right.
So I think we've come to the similar situation in terms of spreading information.
Mm-hmm.
And the only difference is we don't have the hundreds of computers to mediate and help us work it.
Right.
So we're flying not yet, and we're flying in basically an unstable environment.
Right.
And so
and I notice you advise people to read or cite certain sources that I've relied on in terms of my understanding and growth, like Edward Bernays' book Propaganda, 1928, or The Century of the Self documentary, which is so important to understand. You create the need, and then you sell something or make people feel like they need this person or this party or whatever, this religious experience.
Well, the problem is, at the end of the day, I'm sorry to say, people are just too easy. People are easy to manipulate. It's just, I don't know how.
The illusion is everybody thinks they're too smart. Like nobody can hack their brain because they're too smart. I was an extra honors student, and but I got hacked. I had that momentary vulnerability. This was way before the internet was created. But my girlfriend dumped me. Women flirted with me, lied to me to my face. And, within a month, I'm bowing to an altar with a Korean messiah who said democracy is satanic. And within the year, fasting for Richard Nixon on the Capitol steps because God said Nixon should be president, even though I hated Nixon before I got recruited into the Moon cult.
So that was Moonies. You were a Moonie, huh?
Yeah, I was in the Moon cult, and I was, told I was going to, help to lead God's rule because God wants a theocracy. And what we're seeing now with the Christian right, it's the same players, actually, over the 50 years. Sure. The same people, the Council for National Policy, the Moonies. Trump and Pompeo and Esper spoke for the Moonies twice now, virtually, but nevertheless said how great they were. And even though he was a convicted felon who went to jail, and many women came forward saying that he raped them, and now their two sons. One has a gun factory making AR-15s. The other one has a gun cult called the Rod of Iron Ministry, where he thinks we need an AR-15 to worship God and has training camps for civil war. And that's my former cult.
Those are Moon sons?
Yeah, Sean Moon and Justin Moon.
Okay, he trained them well?
Well, they're chips of the old block, unfortunately, and they actually are at war with their mother, Hak Jahan, the survivor of some young moon died in 2012. Calling her the whore of Babylon. Oh. And apparently the shooter in Japan, his mother joined the Moonies and gave all the family wealth to them. So apparently he was very upset with the Moonies. Couldn't get to Hak Jahan to kill her. Found out Abe was speaking. And because Abe and his father and grandfather kind of gave entrance to Japan and politics to the Moonies, he killed Abe. And so the Japanese people are angry as hell. Why? Because the Moonies were responsible for the largest consumer fraud scam in Japanese history. Get this, Dr. Waltzman. They would scan the newspapers for obituaries, go to people's houses, knock on the door, and say their deceased loved one is miserable in the spirit world, and told them that they need to go to the bank and give money so they could do a ceremony to liberate them. And they made somewhere around $1 billion from this. And there are scores of Japanese lawyers representing the 35,000 plus victims and getting their money back. But the Japanese people don't like the Moonies, and the Moonies have infiltrated politics in Japan. So it's very interesting seeing how there's nothing happening in the U.S. regarding, religious cult infiltration into politics and our government. But in Japan, there seems to be something.
Well, is that really true?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really true that there's nothing happening in the U.S.?
Well, there's nothing. Thank you for clarifying.
Is that really true?
The American people are not in uproar against politicians who take money from cults here, whereas in Japan, they're upset with their politicians for being in bed with destructive cults that harm people. That's what I meant to say. So thank you for helping me clarify that one.
Well, like I said, it just goes to show people are just too easy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry.
So I'm a mental health.
I'll tell you, there's another book I want to recommend to people.
Please.
Yeah, it's called Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum.
Yes, there's a sucker born every minute.
Have you read that?
No, I haven't.
Well, it's a spectacular book. Everybody should read it.
P.T. Barnum.
I think it was written I think it came out 1865, something like that.
Wow.
But you can find a PDF of it on the internet.
Okay. I will definitely check that out. We'll add it as a link to the blog that we do.
He had a very realistic view of things.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't pull any punches in his book. I mean, he really told it like it was. And you can see it. He wrote in 1865, things didn't look any different than they do today. I mean, in terms of people and how they are to manipulate. And I don't think it's changed any in the last 2,000 or 3,000 years in any case. So
I agree, except we have a new environment that human beings are adapting to. It's called the internet and social media. Yes. And I'm reading a book right now by an MD neuroscientist, Carl Marcy, has a book out called Rewired. And he cites all the research, especially on the effects on children, to be on social media, shortened attention span, lack of emotional connectedness in real life with people. There's so many aspects of this that's disturbing, but it seems like people are oblivious. They've just assumed this is normal, but this is not normal for human beings to be online so many hours a day and on so many social media platforms.
But the thing of it is, it's appealing to something which has existed all along in human beings.
Right. Need for meaning. Who am I? Where do I belong? What do I believe? And we react to strong emotions, fear and hate, that take our frontal cortexes offline, so we can't think when we're feeling so emotionally aroused. And it seems like a lot of the mainstream media even is wanting more viewers, so they're pushing this kind of content, as opposed to they could have people like you on explaining these techniques. I mean, they really are gems. And if you're listening to this and you're on Twitter, please follow @Cogsec, COGSEC, and check out these little nuggets that cumulatively are painting a very thorough picture of these vulnerabilities, for lack of a better...
So by the way, these slides that I put up, they're from a course that I created.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes. So the course is called Defense Against the Dark Arts of Mass Manipulation Through the Use of New Media.
Is it available, your course?
You know what? Like there's over 400 of these slides. It's divided into like 14 lectures. And I haven't been able to get anybody really in the U.S. interested. I've taught the course abroad. I had a more interesting audience.
Well,
I taught but in the U.S. I couldn't get any interest, or at least I haven't been able to really so far.
I want to please beg you to videotape, if you haven't videotaped past teachings of this course, and put it online. And even ask donations if you even donate it to your
I haven't.
group
Well,
or whatever.
I haven't recorded it, but I have done it. I've done the course twice online. Once in Singapore and once in the UAE. To very interesting groups. I mean, Singapore it was for the Ministry of Defense, and in the UAE it was something equivalent to that.
So what will it take for us to get you to teach it again here in the United States, and we can record it?
Yeah, well,
if you're willing.
Well, maybe I can do that.
I'm really a fan of these slides. They're gems. I've spent decades reading social psychology books and following the top people, but these are really great nuggets that people should really understand and know about. And honestly, we start with the people who are aware and of the danger. They've seen loved ones radicalized and transformed into like strangers. And they want to understand, how did this happen? And you explain social psychology as it applies to social media. It's brilliant, really.
Well, I mean, the two times I taught the course, it worked out very well. I mean, the audience was very receptive, and they seemed to really find it useful. I mean, the main thing to realize is, the sort of the key difference between a cognitive attack and a kinetic attack, a physical attack is.
Yeah.
And in a kinetic attack, you're being attacked. If somebody's coming at you with a knife or a gun or hurling bombs at you, I mean, there's no doubt you're under attack, right?
Right.
But in a cognitive attack, the whole point is that the target shouldn't know they're being attacked in order for it to be really effective.
Right.
Okay, so that's the whole trick, to keep the target unaware, because if the target becomes aware that they are being attacked in this way, just by them becoming aware, it significantly reduces the effect of the attack. Just that alone.
My experience is really, if I do a talk for an hour, and just telling my story and then outlining things like the influence continuum and the bite model of authoritarian control and the fundamental attribution error of social psychology, which I'll take one moment to explain it here for our listeners. It's a bias, an unconscious bias worldwide. When people are trying to understand other people's actions, they overestimate dispositional or personality variables and underestimate the social psychological context and influences on them. And we are social beings, and we're taking in information all the time.
Yes. And especially in the current environment, we're taking in masses of information all the time.
Yeah, and this masses uses the overload technique, because we get numb, because we don't have the capacity to handle more than a small chunk at a time, and people are losing the capacity for deep thought because their attention is getting hacked. And it really is.
Well, it's a matter of practice. Use it or lose it.
That is true.
And that's really what it comes down to.
And as a 68-year-old who got persuaded to go back and get my doctorate, because I realized the law is out of date about 100 years in terms of understanding the human mind. and due influence versus undue influence. And so one of the professors at a forensic think tank at Harvard Medical School said, you need to do a quantitative study on your model and show whether it has efficacy or not. And I said, I'm 63. I'm too old. He said, I'm 77. Do you want help or don't you? I'll supervise your research. And so I did it. But I got smarter from doing this doctoral program. My memory improved, my concentration improved, my writing improved.
Yeah.
And so if anyone wants to get further education, don't let age interfere with your goals at all.
No, absolutely not. So, yes.
So moving on for a minute, if I can, talk to me about your understanding, because you're an expert in AI and deep fakes and these programs that can mimic the voices of anybody, and what's coming down the pike.
A lot of really bad things, I'll tell you that. In fact, it's going to get even worse as social media moves into more immersive environments.
The VR
virtual reality
headsets.
environment, virtual reality environments, augmented reality environments, because this is coming. I mean, this is inevitable.
Yep.
So, I mean, and social media will move into these more and more into this kind of environments. And the problem is, of course, that while, yes, there are many wonderful aspects of these environments, and there are a lot of great things about it, like every other technology, they are a two-edged sword, and there's a lot of really bad, really scary features of these environments that, they don't seem to be getting much attention. I mean, pretty much the same way that nobody really paid attention to the downsides of social media until things had really gotten out of hand.
Right.
And, during the years I had this program at DARPA, which ended in 2015, during the 4 or 5 years before that, I couldn't hardly get anybody interested in this at all. And the government, nobody wanted to listen. Nobody was in. And I kept warning people. I said, if you don't start paying attention to this, it's going to come up and bite you in the behind, and you're going to be very sorry. And then,
we are very sorry.
Well,
this country
unfortunately,
is really
nobody
in
listened.
trouble. Yeah.
I mean, the only people who I think were paying real attention to all this work were people who you really wouldn't like to be paying attention to it, and who are willing to use it for the means that I was warning about.
Right.
So they paid attention, but unfortunately, the authorities who are supposed to protect us, they have not paid much attention.
Right.
And the government's response has been pretty pathetic.
Yes.
I mean, really pathetic, I would say.
Yep.
And then, and while they were ignoring all of this, at the same time, a whole industry has grown up, which, it's a mercenary influence industry. They'll run influence campaigns for anybody, for any subject, for money. I mean, it's a business.
Yeah, there's a lot of mercenaries. They're hired troll farms, for example.
All sorts. I mean, everything from, well-known public relations firms, big public relations firms, people who are doing hundreds of $millions of business, down to, 2 or 3 man shops. Mm-hmm. It spans the whole range. I mean, it is also, by the way, one of our great technology exports. Right. Is, because people from all over the world are hiring our people to run these campaigns for them.
Oh, my goodness.
So, for example, it came out, in 2015, it came out that the Russians had done I think they booked like $50 million in business with Ketchum Public Relations.
I think it was $100 million over 10
well,
years.
I think it was $100 million that the Russians had spent total.
I see.
But I think it was $50 million that was booked that showed up on Ketchum's books. Or at least it was something like that.
Yeah.
But it was a lot of money just from the Russians, which makes absolutely good sense, right? I mean, if I were the Russians, I would have done exactly the same thing. I mean, it's great to have these guys at the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, but those guys, they're Russians. So that means that their understanding of American audiences is necessarily limited. I mean, as clever and talented as those guys may be, there's still some natural limitation. I mean, if you're not native to the culture, your understanding is always going to be somehow limited, right?
Right.
So, of course, why not hire guys who are sitting, in Washington, D.C., who have all the connections, they know everything what to do.
Yeah.
So of course you would do that. And
Well,
and the Russians aren't the only ones to hire those people either. I mean, the customer list of these companies are, pretty phenomenal once you really get down to it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they hire them to do operations in the U.S. They hire people to do operations in their own countries to
Yeah.
help them set it up. I mean, so it's a big business. Now, in terms of, so going back to this, to the immersive environments,
Yes.
those environments offer potential to do emotional manipulation of people that is way beyond anything that's possible in what I'm going to call by now classical social media,
Mm-hmm.
like Twitter, Facebook, and everything else, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can do some things there, but nothing compared to what you can do in an immersive environment.
Right.
Because in an immersive environment, you have two things which are really critical. You have what's called embodiment and you have presence. So embodiment and presence means, you basically you're there. Instead of being a third-party observer to something like you are on a flat
Right.
screen,
Right.
you're actually put in the center of the action.
Right.
And all the channels of attack on your system, and I will use the word attack,
Mm-hmm.
are open,
Yeah.
right? Sight, sound, everything you can imagine. And not only that,
Mm-hmm.
but with those kind of environments, with the kind of hardware that you're wearing, they can monitor your reactions. They can build a complete profile of you in real time.
Yeah.
Because those kind of biometric measurements that these systems, I mean, the ones that exist today are relatively primitive, but you can tell what's coming down the line,
Right.
right? And so they'll be able to build up psychological profiles of people in real time, which means that they'll be able to measure your reactions to everything that's happening and have the ability to make modifications and changes in real time to
Yeah.
respond to you, to get maximum response. And they could do it on an individual basis, on a one-by-one basis at a massive scale. So you have what I'm going to call the age of mass customization
Uh-huh.
of messaging. And that's good. And these things that you mentioned, being able to imitate voices and create characters and everything else, those are an integral part of it.
Yeah.
It'll make it it just makes things more convincing.
Yeah, I read somewhere where they can identify your closest friends and families and the image of their faces, and then take attributes of people that you know and trust and put it on other people in this environment so that you're unconsciously reacting as if they were your friends.
Yes, not only that, but the whole concept of mimicry. So mimicry is a very powerful motivating force, right? I mean, con men have
Explain it,
traditionally.
please, for our listeners.
So con men have traditionally used this technique on one-on-one close-up cons.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is, as they're talking to you, they begin to imitate, to mimic
Right.
maybe your hand gestures, your intonation of voice, your turn of phrase, and as the longer they talk to you and interact with you, the more and more like you they start to become. And once they become more like you and mimic you more, you become more open to them.
I first learned about this in 1980, Dr. Waltzman, when I studied neuro-linguistic programming, NLP,
Yes.
but they called it mirroring.
Yes,
You
mimicry.
mirror the breathing, you mirror
Yes.
the predicates, etc.
So you learned about this in the 80s, but con men have known this and used this technique for forever. I mean, this is old as the hills. But now, in a virtual reality environment, you could do this at scale.
Yeah.
You could do it to millions of people simultaneously. You could make it so that a politician getting up and giving a speech in a virtual reality environment, you can fix it so that every single one of those million viewers, they're looking at the same guy, but they're not exactly seeing the same thing.
Oh, wow.
They're seeing something which is very slightly modified. So I could take, for example, a person's face, and I can blend some of the features
Right.
of their face into the politician's face as they're speaking.
Yep.
And once I do that, that politician will become much more sympathetic. I'll have much more empathy towards that politician.
Yeah.
I mean, there was some really fun experiments done like this at Stanford some years ago.
B.J.
where they-
Fogg's lab or somewhere else at Stanford?
I don't.
Persuasive.
I'd have. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I think so. I can send you the papers.
Sure.
But But they didn't do it in a virtual reality environment. They did it with actual pictures. I mean, they claimed in these experiments, they showed that if you blended like 40% of somebody's features into a politician's face, you're gonna be able to actually shift the election. Yeah. I mean, it's that powerful that you can actually make a real difference. And that was only one-on-one, right? I mean, they were doing that a person at a time. But in a virtual reality environment, which they did not have, I can do this, at a massive scale. I mean, that's just one trick.
Yeah, and it makes polling obsolete because, as you said, they're getting real-time feedback to your brain's reactions to these stimuli, and they can keep refining it.
But do you know that there are already companies that are doing that? Okay, and the way they're doing, I mean, you've seen these companies where they like test pilots for TV shows or commercials. They sit you down in front of a TV or to have people in a theater,
right?
And they show you a commercial or a pilot,
right?
And at periodically they freeze it and they put up a question, and and answer your question and tell you how you reacted to that, right? Okay. Well, these companies now, these new companies, what they can do is they can put you in front of a TV, but then they wire you up completely, right?
Right.
So they can measure all of these biometrics, all of these things about you. Yeah. And basically, instead of having to ask you how you're reacting to these things, well, they just can measure it.
And people may not even know how they really think or
feel. So
right?
This is much better. This is much better because it's leaving out the interpretation part of it. I mean, when somebody just answers a question, like in a poll, you don't know how people really feel. I mean, you don't know how they're coloring it for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. So it's not completely accurate. But in this case, well, they're measuring it, and there you have it. So, for example, there's a group called the Affective Computing Group at MIT, at the Media Lab, run by the Professor Rosalind Picard. Mm-hmm. And there have been a couple of spin-offs from MIT, a couple of companies, just some other companies doing this kind of work. So this is already becoming a business. I mean, one of the most fun examples I saw, some of these guys, they put up case studies, of projects they've done for people.
Right.
So they wanted to know about product placement on shelves in a grocery store. So they actually built, a mock-up grocery store with shelves, and they had somebody go down the aisle who was all wired up and go down and looking at the shelves to see where their eyes,
right,
what they were looking at, how long they looked at it, and so on and so forth. So so they could just see how people reacted to different kind of product placements instead of asking them. Right. They just measured it. So lots of things like that. So in these immersive environments, that's what you have. So I can fine-tune my messaging to you and my manipulation of you in real time.
So let me ask you about China, who is as close to an authoritarian state using high-tech AI that we see in the world, where they're getting checks if they're doing socially acceptable behavior, etc. And we know that they have re-education programs to try to brainwash Uyghur Muslims. For me, it freaks me out. Not that it's what's happening in the United States isn't freaking me out. That's even freaking me out more because they're also collecting DNA from these folks.
Yeah. Well, not only those folks. From a lot of folks.
Right. All these inexpensive DNA tests they might be able to hack or create a front group that can collect it, right? Well, I'm scared to do a DNA test for this reason, honestly.
Well, it's very hard to tell where the results are going because however much people say they're protecting your data, well, it doesn't really work that well. People are getting, all kinds of organizations are getting hacked all the time, and massive amounts of data are being stolen. I mean, this is happening continuously.
Right.
So no matter how people say they're protecting your stuff, I mean, I would always take that with a grain of salt.
Right.
Just
don't put anything online that you don't want broadcast is what I was.
Yeah. Well, yes, I would. That seems reasonable. But the Chinese are doing a lot of work. So, for example, in computer vision, they do a lot of work in computer vision systems. But a lot of it is based on facial. The goal is about facial recognition. Mm-hmm. And I read a really interesting story one time about one application of this. So it was a game, some big game in a huge stadium, and they were scanning people as they came in the entrance. with all the entrances, they had these cameras, and they were, scanning people.
Right.
And there was a guy who comes in, and by the time he got to his seat, the police were descending on this guy.
Whoa.
That fast. It
Wow.
turned out this guy was a wanted criminal. I mean, not a political. I mean, he was a thief of some kind of, but an ordinary kind of crime.
Right.
But the point is, he was wanted.
Right.
And this system, that quickly, as he was coming in the door, picked him up so fast that by the time he got to his seat, they nabbed him.
Wow.
So that's what they put up as a great application.
Yeah, there was a company, Clearview or something, that was doing facial recognition.
Oh, it's a lot of companies. There's a lot of
a lot.
companies. Yes, yes.
So can I
it's
ask?
It's a big thing.
Can I ask
in
you
fact,
to? I'm sorry. Keep going.
I know. I was going to say, on my first tour at DARPA, which ended in 1991, I ran the DARPA Image Understanding Program, the computer vision program. That's what I ran. So,
1991. That was before the internet hit publicly. I think, isn't that true?
I don't know. I mean, it was coming online, really. It was pretty. I mean, when the first nodes of the Arpanet went online?
Tell me. Tell us.
1969.
What? Wow.
Yes. 1969, the first 3 nodes, the first 3 servers went online. One of them is sitting in the basement of Belter Hall at UCLA.
Mm-hmm.
One was in Utah, and one was at Stanford AI Lab.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1969, those 3 lines went live.
Wow.
And boy, if you look at the history, you could see how the number of servers multiplied like crazy.
Right.
Until finally the Arpanet, the original name was the Arpanet,
Mm-hmm.
because it was originally funded by ARPA or DARPA.
Right.
The name has changed over the years. The D comes and goes,
Right.
depending on the politics.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's just Advanced Research Projects Agency, sometimes Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It goes a little bit change here and there.
Right.
But ARPA was the one DARPA was the one that funded this thing.
Wow, you really.
And in fact,
were
I'll tell you.
at the
But I'll
beginning.
tell you something. Yes. So, and in fact, when that went online in 1969, that was at UCLA. I had an office in the basement of the computer center at Caltech, just down the road from there.
Wow.
So, yes. So that was a
Wow.
long time. In fact, the guy who was the director of DARPA at the time in 1969, at the time it went online, he told me something really I thought was really fascinating. And he said that the success of the Arpanet depended on the fact that the Department of Defense had no interest in it whatsoever.
Hmm.
I thought that was a fantastic statement for the guy to make. And I thought about it, and okay, I get it. And his explanation was, had the Defense Department been interested, well, there would have been like a food fight between the Air Force. They would have wanted to control the Navy, the Army. Everybody would have been fighting over it. He said, but since nobody was interested, it was able to really flourish and develop by itself.
And my recollection is the folks who were online, maybe I'm going to the 90s now, were feeling like the internet was a chance to rebel and to share information and create community.
Well, but the whole original motivation, if you read Licklider wrote a paper describing what became the internet. I think the paper was 63 or 64, it was around that. But it was called Memorandum for Members of the Intergalactic Computing Network.
Intergalactic?
Yeah, wait a second. I'll tell you the exact name because I would encourage everybody to read this.
Well, you'll give me the link. We'll put it in the blog. And
Yeah.
people can
Wait a
get all
second. Here,
these.
wait. I'm just. Let's see. Yeah, Licklider. He was in the Information Processing Techniques office at ARPA, and he used the term in the early 1960s. But where was the memorandum? I always forget the exact name, but it was something like, Memorandum to the Members of the Intergalactic Computing Network. It was some name like that.
Yeah, I believe you. Well, we'll add the link to the blog
Yeah.
on my website. Can I ask you, please, and you can decline, to opine about QAnon?
I don't know what there's to say about it, really.
Well, one thing that I came to learn when I was researching it was that I talked with someone who said that he knew the first people who were doing it, and it was a goof on Trump. And then they realized they could sell merchandise and make money. And then the Russians got involved. At least that's what he told me. And I later met an alternate reality gaming technologist, Jim Stewartson, who said they're using Pokemon Go, to drop little messages to get people engaged as a game that then became live, where people were protesting in the streets.
Yeah.
You don't feel comfortable saying anything about
Well,
your
I don't know what
take
this
on
is. Well, to me, it's just another example of how easy it is to manipulate people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was a nice example. I thought they did a nice job, and
They did a nice job, meaning an effective job at conning millions of people.
Yeah, speaking as a technician.
Yeah.
They did a nice, very credible job. They did.
And apparently, Ginny Thomas messaged Mark Meadows to the effect of that she got infected by those memes.
But to me, it's just one in a long line of examples. I mean, it wasn't. I didn't see anything that remarkable in it.
I see.
I mean, not from a technical perspective.
Right.
So I mean, it's just one more example of the kind of things you could do.
Yes.
I mean, and it's worth studying as a case study of how this kind of operation works.
Yeah.
But there are others. There are many. I mean.
Yeah, my research for the book, The Cult of Trump, came up with the realization there were actual cults in the cult of Trump, and it was the cult leaders of some 40 million people in America who are part of this new apostolic reformation movement where they think they have to take over the government for Jesus. But it goes back to William Lind and Paul Weyrich, decades ago, using fourth generation psyops and psychological warfare crap.
Yes. So, but that's why I say, I mean, it was one example of a successful application of these kind of techniques.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for me, that's the main interest in it.
So I'm going to put you on the spot, maybe. Can't we scale deprogramming? Can't we figure out how to help people reality test what's true and what's not true and what's real and what's a psyop? Or
well, I mean, one thing you can, when you talk about deprogramming.
Yeah.
I mean, is there really any difference between deprogramming and programming?
Yes.
That's the first question you need to ask. Is
As
it really different?
As someone who was deprogrammed, did deprogramming, then I did exit counseling, etc.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally different because the aim is to ask questions to get the person to reflect on their own experiences, teaching them social psychology, with an aim to encouraging the person to be in their bodies and reconnect with their core values versus creating a pseudo-identity in the image of the cult leader or the ideology and enforcing the pseudo-identity that's blindly obedient and will do whatever they're told. For me, it's very different.
Well, from my perspective, the end result, it isn't that different. I mean, the method may be a little different.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the things that you just described, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end, you're getting you're trying to put somebody in a different world. You get somebody to subscribe to a different worldview.
See, I'm trying to put myself into your shoes. I am trying to not impose my Jewish belief system or my model as a therapist on people. What I've learned over decades of doing psychotherapy is that if people are given the freedom but also the education to understand how the mind works and how social psychology works, they can get on a healthier path where they're not dissociated. They're in their body in the real world. Ooh, I just realized my jacket was up. Anyway, who cares? Yeah, I definitely do not resonate with your perception that deprogramming is alternate programming. Because for me, it's helping people say to themselves, how do I really feel? What do I really want? Do I like being lied to and exploited and work, 21 hours a day for no pay for a foreign government? Because I didn't understand that. The whole world had been recast as a struggle of good and evil and God and Satan. And Koreans are the master race and Americans are the servants.
Mm-hmm.
And when people who were ex-members sat down with me and said, what did you think you were joining when you went to that first lecture?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they said it wasn't religious. Well, what happened? Like, if you knew it was what it was, would you have ever gone? Yeah. And my answer was absolutely, categorically not.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
But then I go back to my original question.
Please.
How many people is this actually going to work on, the way you described it?
So that is a question of money and how to scale this, but
it's more than a question of money. I mean, it's a question of nature of people. I mean, how many people are actually have what it takes to really make sense out of that and to understand it the way you're describing it?
So all I can say is there are now millions of ex-members of these types of authoritarian cult groups who have, bitten the poison apple, got, sick, and now they're okay. And for me, empowering them to share their stories to help destigmatize the fact that people can be hacked and they can be programmed with ridiculous beliefs that are completely alien to their core values. I really do believe, I guess maybe I'm hopeful. I mean, I know that you have a grandchild that is playing at your house. I have a son. I'm thinking of future generations. I don't feel like I can throw up my hands and just say it's hopeless. So I'm gonna.
I didn't say it was hopeless. I'm asking the question because what I doubt is yes, millions of people may have gone through this kind of attitude, change in their view.
Yeah.
But how many of them went through it as an intellectual exercise versus as a purely emotional exercise? Mm-hmm. I question a lot more.
I see.
So, and if it turns out that it's the majority of people who it was mostly an emotional reaction, then I wouldn't say they were deprogrammed, that they were reprogrammed. Mm-hmm. And reprogramming is a lot. It's the same thing as programming them to begin with. Because in programming them to begin with, it's all based on an emotional manipulation of various sorts. And deprogramming them, if they're not seriously taking an intellectual approach, then it really is another, just more emotional manipulation to get them from one place to another. And now they may have gotten to the place you want, but probably mostly as a result of emotional manipulation as opposed to some kind of really intellectual analysis.
So do you believe that love is an emotional manipulation, or it's something that, is real?
Well, emotional manipulation is real.
Right.
How is that not real?
But what about love? Would you say that's always an emotional manipulation? Or awe or fervor? Do you think that's always a result of some external force manipulating?
I don't know. I'm not sure how I would to answer that, but I think at the end of the day, a lot of it does come down to emotional manipulations, to emotional reactions. I mean, I think most of people's reactions to things are emotional, and most of the ways you get people to do things and to react to things, it's through emotions.
Oh, I definitely agree with you, but I can also say that most of my clients that I've worked with over 4 decades, when let's say they already realize the group is not what they thought it was, I need to remind them that emotions are real, in the sense that they can influence us, and that if we, for example, feel like we want to go back to college because the group told us to drop out, that's not selfish. Your feeling of wanting to improve yourself and learn new things is not a bad emotion.
Well, but I'm not saying emotions are good or bad. I mean, emotions are, people believed for a long time that, reasoning and emotions were really separate things, right? And that there was even a separate part, that the brain was even, physically identifiable parts in the limbic system where they had, specific emotional parts and specific cognitive parts. And, that's a lot of that been debunked.
Right.
That no, there actually aren't separate things, and emotion. And in fact, there's plenty of work that shows that without emotions, you couldn't actually reason properly.
So that these Dr. things that Barrett's work about emotions. We need the cognitive.
Yes, there's a lot of work done on that area, especially in the last 10, 15 years, which shows that emotions are an integral part of your cognitive functioning. You can't. It isn't that, well, if I could only overcome emotion, I would be a much better,
No, it's not.
I would do much better analysis, and it doesn't work like that. That's just this was wrong.
Right.
So, I mean, emotions are real, and when you talk, manipulation is a word that has a lot of negative association with it. But to me, it's like mechanical. It's a technique. It isn't a good or a bad thing. I can, instead of a manipulation, what about afterward, induce? I mean, induce an emotion in you.
Or elicit an emotion.
Elicit an emotion.
That has a little
Does that sound better?
Emotional tinge to it.
But that's nonsense, because it's the same. I mean, you're saying the same. It's just another word for the same thing.
Right. Good point.
Right? Elicit emotions, induce emotion, manipulate emotions. It's the same thing, just different words.
Right.
So then so what is it? So these things aren't negative. This is just how people work.
Yeah.
And you can work with that.
Right. So we're wrapping up, and I wonder if there's any parting words you'd like to share with our listeners.
Beware of the metaverse.
I totally agree.
That's my parting words.
Yeah.
What are you going to do to insist? Okay, the government dropped the ball on classical social media. What are you going to do to get them to actually have to do something when it comes to the metaverse, when it comes to virtual reality, immersive environments? Are we going to make the same mistake over and over again?
It appears that
probably.
it appears there really needs to be an understanding that we're talking about planetary survival and quality of life and human rights. To me, because if we don't stand up for human rights and help each other, it's looking dark, and I don't like it.
Yeah. It's people are just it's just lining up to be victims, essentially.
Well, thank you very much for all your work, and I really do want to encourage you to do that course, because I would like selfishly to take it. But I'd like to share it with all of my listeners. And there's a lot of former cult members out there that are realizing that their negative experience, and it may have been decades ago, could actually play a role in a way, kind of like an immune system response to the human body politic. That, hey, it happened to me. Don't be so confident that it can't happen to you, and beware.
Let me tell you something. Even people who study this for a living and who deal with this are fooled all the time. People still take it in when they see the cost, $1.99 instead of $2. they get the right reaction. Even they know that they're being they're being manipulated. It still happens because these things they're so buried into your system.
Yeah.
They're deeply parts of your system, and so to try to overcome these things is really, really hard.
Right.
I mean, a really interesting problem is how can you detect instances of attempts at this type of manipulation in, for example, an immersive environment? How do you see it coming? And it turns out, well, if the more you think about it, you'll see that it is very difficult to determine. But if there's going to be any kind of system that offers you any protection at all, that's a problem that you're going to have to be able to solve.
Right.
And part of the thing that makes it, even if you look at the simple version of it, or what you might think is a simple version of it, like some really overt attempt.
Right.
Like somebody was telling me about a cartoon, a version of, a version of some fairy tale, a new version. Where the fairy is like Tinkerbell kind of fairy, where the character is black and overtly gay. Okay, so there's a message there, and it's not hard to miss, right? I mean, so that's really an overt example. But how easy is it really to detect that that's an overt scheme to message you? Because in order to do so, put yourself in the position of a machine,
right,
to do that automatically. Now, you may know a lot of things about gay issues. You may know a lot of things about racism. You're going to know a lot of things before you're going to recognize that overt attempt to message you, right? But that's a lot of stuff that you have to have as a background,
right?
Even to get that. Now, if you take more subtle things, like suppose that you have a soap opera which goes on for many, many episodes. Yeah. And there are little things, what the producers, what the director is trying to get you to do is to identify in some way with one of the characters, to become sympathetic for some action that they take, to get you to do. But imagine that it's built up over 20 episodes, right? The initial seed is planted in episode 19, and then there's a few other little things dropped, so that by the time you get to episode 42, and then all of a sudden the character takes an action, which now, because of this kind of preparation, you think is perfectly natural and acceptable,
right?
Which otherwise you might not have. So how would you get a machine to detect that automatically? Well, that's really, really hard, right? I mean, the example with the fairy was hard enough in a cartoon, which was overt, but this is really brutal. Because first of all, it's built up over time, which means that it's not, with the fairy in the cartoon, one look at it and you have the message.
Right.
It isn't something that has to be built up over time. But this, what I just described, so that means that you have to build up a temporal context.
Yeah.
And you have to
incremental influence.
Yes, because the whole message, the whole scheme to do the messaging is built up incrementally over time. So it's just. If looking back at it, somebody may say, "Oh yeah, I saw there was that thing that happened, and it seemed a little bit out of place, but okay, I ignored it."
Right.
And then another thing that happened, well, it was a little bit out of place, but I ignored that, and so on. And then by the time you get to the end, well, you've added up a lot of stuff, and there you go.
So as you were describing that, I was thinking of a 5-minute clip a friend showed me from a video game. I think it was Assassin's Creed. That was an actual hypnotic induction in the video game.
Yeah.
He wanted to know my professional opinion as someone who studied hypnosis. And I'm like, holy crap, this is a commercial game.
Okay, now think about how you would achieve the same effect in an immersive environment. You have a much greater possibility to do that in an immersive environment.
Yeah, I'll add one more vulnerability that seems to be happening culturally, and that is the use of psychedelics.
Yes, and one of the most interesting thing I read recently.
Yes.
Okay, so in the psychotherapy community, of course, as you know, in the last years they've been experimenting with microdosing of LSD and psilocybin and so on and so on. So somebody asked the question: could I achieve the same effect? Could I induce self and what was it? An SET, self-experience.
Sorry, I can't help you with that particular.
Anyway, it's something that you get supposedly in a psychedelic experience.
Mm-hmm.
Self-transcendence, a self-transcendent experience, an STE. That's what it is.
Okay.
Can I induce a self-transcendent experience similar to what you get in microdosing and therapy by putting somebody in an immersive environment without the drugs?
I would say probably.
These experiments showed that more than probably.
Uh-huh.
It showed that you could actually do a pretty good job of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a paper where they describe the experiment in great detail with how they did it, and I think you can even actually try this thing that they described.
Mm.
But the point is, imagine if you could elicit a similar effect in a virtual reality environment that you can by drugging somebody. That's got to already tip you off that there's something more going on there than you really like to know about.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm hoping, whoever's listening to this and has kids or grandkids or just cares about planetary survival and quality of life. This is a problem worth addressing ASAP. And Rand Waltzman has a lot of ideas because he's been doing this for decades and decades. Dr. Waltzman, thank you so much for granting me this interview.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
What an amazing man. I wanted to share with you an email, a follow-up email from him, where he gave me the link to Licklider's original description in 2001 of what he thought the internet will become, as well as a link to P.T. Barnum's book, Humbugs of the World, that he talks about. Both links will be included in the blog that will contain the video of our interview. Also, I just wanted to read, he said, "And don't let my cynicism and seemingly hopeless attitude get you down. If I really thought it was that hopeless, I wouldn't continue to fight on as I do." So he closes out the email with, "After all, Nikos Kantzatzakis wrote in his book Zorba the Greek, life is struggle, only death is not. So as long as we are alive, we keep fighting the good fight. Hopefully, I haven't traumatized your listeners too badly. Best." So please, let's have hope and let's roll up our sleeves and let's work together for a better world. Thanks.